Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legend of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we're on day 4 of why these champs suck and how to fix them. And I just want to point out, before I start this video, I did not make this list of champions because there is one champion we're going to discuss today that you are going to be very surprised that is on this list, because I was very surprised. I want you to remember that this list is created by Riot, because Riot gave us all the champions that have a 50+% win rate, and therefore they also gave us the ones that don't have a 50+% win rate in any deck at the moment. And that's in any deck across, as far as I can tell, all ranks according to their internal data. But one of the champions is quite surprising, so don't at me for this list of champions. I'm just going to talk about the champions that have a no deck with a 50+% win rate, and therefore you can probably assume that, you know, maybe something is wrong with them. So let's dive in straight away and get the ball rolling. So here it is. Here is the shocker. It's Lucian, okay? And this really took me aback when I first sort of, you know, looked at the list of champions that, you know, don't have a 50+% win rate in any deck, and Lucian doesn't even have a 49% win rate in any deck, according to Riot, which is kind of surprising. But, you know, if you do look at meta tier lists or whatever, you won't see that much Lucian, and that, I think, maybe isn't too much of a surprise. And so first, I think let's sort of diagnose why Lucian doesn't have a single deck that does have a good win rate, a win rate that you could climb with. And I think it has to do with Thresh Nasus, because I think Thresh Nasus has kind of just replaced Lucian. It's a general sort of theory in card games that if you want to win in a card game, you need a deck that goes slightly slower than your opponent or much faster. And in the case of like a Lucian Shadow Isles deck versus Thresh Nasus, you know, Thresh Nasus will just go that little bit slower than any sort of Lucian Shadow Isles deck, and therefore has the upper hand over it and is probably a better deck. And I think that that is probably true. And so Lucian, therefore, has kind of been pushed aside, because Lucian, I think it's a fairly safe assumption to make, is meant to synergize with Shadow Isles. Of course, he has things to do with dying, which is very Shadow Isles. I know that his lore is very intertwined with Thresh and dying, so, you know, and you know, so it's very Shadow Isles, that whole thing. So the theme is there, and unfortunately, you know, some of the cards that fit well with Lucian, like Blighted Caretaker, have recently got nerfed, and we might even see more nerfs. You know, things like Curse Keeper or Ravenous Butcher could also get nerfed, and that could also hit Lucian as well. So Lucian, unfortunately, isn't in a great spot, despite me looking at Lucian and thinking, how the hell do I buff this card? And thinking, I don't know. You know, there isn't really anything wrong with Lucian. Lucian, I think, is a very well-designed champion. You know, a perfectly mediocre first side, a very powerful leveled up side, a good champion spell that synergizes with what, you know, Lucian decks generally want to do. The design of Lucian, I would say, is one of the better ones in the game, and so I don't really want to touch it. And that brought me on to, you know, looking at his wider archetype. These are all the cards that they die on them in Demacia, and I'm pretty sure that like cards like Radiant Guardian, Senna, and Vanguard Redeemer, you know, synergize with Lucian in some way or another. Obviously Senna. And I was looking at these 3 cards and maybe Remembrance, and I was thinking, well, all these 4 cards are pretty much fine as well. Maybe you could look at Senna, but I don't really know what you would do, because you can't really make Senna a 4/3. She'd probably be a bit too good. So, you know, there isn't much to do with Senna either. So that basically brought me onto Dawn Speakers, which, as far as I can tell, is the only card that I think you could warrant a buff for in this whole little package. And so I'm going to talk about Dawn Speakers, because it's a card that hasn't really ever seen too much play outside of the very, very early days, where it was actually the best deck in the game. Since then, Dawn Speakers hasn't really been a thing, and I think, you know, there's plenty of ways that you can buff Dawn Speakers. This, of course, is another one of those sort of value engines, and the biggest buff you can give any value engine is always decreasing its mana. So if you wanted to do that and make Dawn Speakers a 2-mana card, you know, you might need to bring down the health to, say, 3 or something like that. You know, that's something that's very possible to do, or I think you could just increase maybe the health to 5, you know, make it a sort of Azir-like, but, you know, it kind of still would require a certain deck to be built around it. But I actually prefer buffing this to be a 2-mana card, a 2-mana 1/3, something like that. I think that could create some, you know, powerful effects with Lucian in there, and, you know, be a sort of different aggro deck that potentially we haven't seen in some time, and would be, you know, quite fun to play with Dawn Speakers, because, you know, this is a card that kind of doesn't exist at the moment, and so essentially we'd be getting a new card that I think could be pretty strong and would be fun to play with. We haven't really seen a Demacia like aggro deck in a little while. You know, scouts haven't been around for a bit now, and as I say, Lucian hasn't really, like, you know, we had Lucian Azir, I guess. So I mean, you could call it a combo deck, really, rather than, like, you know, an aggro deck, because essentially that deck was all about sort of leveling Lucian with Azir and Emperor's Dice and the Sand Soldiers. It was much more of a combo deck, I thought. So, you know, I wouldn't mind seeing like an all-out, you know, maybe Noxus Demacia aggro, or, you know, Shadow Isles Demacia aggro deck come about, and I think a buff to Dawn Speakers could be the way you do that. But regarding Lucian, I really don't know what else to say, because I don't think there is much else to say, to be honest. I think Lucian is one of the better designed champions of the game, so leave him alone. Next up, though, we have a champion that I think most people will agree could potentially use a buff, and that is Zilean. Obviously not a surprise to be on this list of champions without a 50+% win rate. I'm pretty sure most people are aware of that by now. And so what went wrong with Zilean? Well, I've talked about this before, in that a lot of his sort of cards that came out with him, Time in a Bottle being a sort of good example, but so is Zilean's Chrono Shift, kind of don't really synergize that well with Zilean himself, and, you know, tend to synergize better with other things like Talia, which is a bit odd. So that, I think, is one of the main reasons why Zilean, you know, maybe hasn't quite, you know, done exactly what we would have wanted him to or expected him to in the metagame. And so how do we change Zilean? Well, I think we have to be careful with Zilean, because we know that, or we assume that Zilean is meant to synergize with the Piltover and Zorn champion that will be coming out, or at least that's what I think. You know, and you could see this, just as I've mentioned before, by looking at sort of Zilean himself is pretty Piltover and Zorn. Creating cards in your deck is Piltover and Zorn. Creating fleeting cards is very Piltover and Zorn, so it feels like the synergy is there, and, you know, that is probably where Zilean is meant to be going. And so I don't want to, you know, change Zilean drastically, and they probably won't make any changes to Zilean at all, because, you know, imagine if Soraka came out with Tom Kench. It would have been weird, right? We all would have been questioning, well, where the hell do I play Soraka? Like, you know, you can fit her in some decks, but it doesn't feel, you know, those decks wouldn't ever be great. And I worry that potentially, you know, that's what Zilean is now, and, you know, when we get the next expansion, it'll be like, that makes sense, you know, that's where Zilean is meant to go, obviously, and that's where we'll play him. So I still think that could happen, so I'm going to avoid touching Zilean right now in case that is what happens, but I do think we can buff some other cards, and the first one I want to alert your attention to is Psy Scout. Now, I know that Psy Scout, based off sort of the art, is a Talia card, perhaps more than a Zilean card, but I think it can act very well for both, and both champions, I think most people would agree, need a buff, so this would be fine. And I think let's make Psy Scout a 3/3, which is a much more dangerous, you know, stat line, particularly for elusive units, of course. It synergizes with them both, of course, because, well, I mean, Talia obviously is a landmark deck, but Zilean also, you know, puts time bombs in your deck, and, you know, Psy Scout predicts as well, so, you know, there's a lot of synergy between them, and if you can get a 3/3 elusive on 3 that also has predict, that's a strong card. And I think what this would really help Shurima do is, Merciless Hunter is far too good, we can all agree on that, and, you know, so it probably will get nerfed, which will bring down Shurima as a whole, as a region, again. So I think what would be better is, instead of having this one incredible 3-drop that is just, you know, way too good, instead, let's give them 2 good 3-drops. You know, some decks will play Merciless Hunter, some decks will play Psy Scout, and that way you have sort of two good options rather than one like crazy option and the rest being no good. This will give you good options on turn 3, which I think is crucial, and I think they released Merciless Hunter as they did because the devs understand that like every region needs a good turn 3 play, and you can pretty much look at each region and go, if that region does not have a non-champion good 3-drop, then that region tends to struggle. And we saw it when they buffed a card like Aphelios and Trapper in Freljord. Freljord was the worst region in the game for some time, and then all of a sudden they buffed Aphelios and Trapper from a 2-2 to a 3-3, which is a very significant buff for a 3-drop, and Freljord became very good very quick, in part because now all of a sudden they had a good 3-drop to play. And so, things like that can make a big difference. So Side Scout would be the first thing that I would look at changing into a 3-3. Of course, that would allow it to block Fearsomes as well. So there are, a 3-3 is better than a 2-4, let's just put it that way. And Kahiri the Returned is another card that I would buff pretty significantly. Kahiri, of course, the Returned has never been like a great deck to play, but I don't see why that necessarily should be the case. I don't see why this has to be a sort of meme card that you put in your deck. I don't see why this card couldn't also just have a draw 1 slapped on the bottom of it, when you summon this card. I think that would be perfectly fine and allow for some really fun combo synergies with, War Mother's Call and the like, and allow you to find more Kahiri the Returns. You create more of them in your deck, and then, you slap down more of them as you keep drawing them. I think that would be a fun way to just improve this card by quite a lot, but also, help the whole Predict archetype potentially have another deck as well. So I'm all in on Kahiri. Give me Kahiri the Returned with, extra effects like a draw 1. Would be pretty nice, I think, in helping, a Kahiri deck actually become pretty scary and, pretty good just by that one change. And that is probably how I change Zilean for now. As I said, I don't want to go, like, too overboard with the whole Zilean thing. Let's push it a bit in some little areas, but I don't, I don't want to send Zilean off to be, like, in a tier 1 deck tomorrow, and then have the Piltover and Zorn champion release and Zilean and that have a really good synergy. And if that's really good, then we just get this horrendous, meta again, where one sort of new deck comes out of nowhere and dominates, like we have seen somewhat recently. So that's what I'm trying to avoid here, if you can understand. And finally, we come to Aphelios. Poor Aphelios obviously got nerfed very significantly. I would say one of the biggest nerfs that a champion has ever received, and rightfully so, I might add, because of course Aphelios was a complete stain upon the metagame. The Aphelios meta, in my opinion, was much worse than this one. Games lasting half an hour and just a feeling of like nothing else could even come close to beating such a value engine. And I've actually seen some people, believe it or not, suggesting that they should change the moon weapons back to 2 mana. And to those people, I think, how short is your memory? Like, what is going on in that head of yours to think that they should ever bring these back to 2 mana? It is insane. Now, maybe you could buff certain certain blades. That could be something that they do. Maybe make this 2-2 and maybe, make this 2-2 as well. You could do small things like that, I think, but bringing them back down to 2 mana is a joke. Let's not do that, because as I said, that was a terrible metagame, and as soon as you do that, it will return straight away, and you'll hate it again because everyone did. So let's not do that for Aphelios. I think the first thing that we need to do is obviously buff Aphelios' health back to 3. When they initially made that change of bringing his health down 1, I said literally the day of those patch notes, this won't make a difference. That doesn't matter for Aphelios nearly as much as the moon weapons cost being 2 does. Eventually they got round to the right nerf, but I think, it does make a small difference, and it would be a buff that would help Aphelios at least survive so that you could create 2 moon weapons, for instance, and that would be a nice thing to have for Aphelios if, he had a bit more survivability. And that's probably where I'd leave it with Aphelios for now. And let me explain why. Aphelios didn't really... Of course, Aphelios came out on his own. He's kind of the only champion that, has so far come out, like, just on his own out of the blue. You know, no other champion is like that. Every other champion, you know, tends to come out with other things that you can kind of like spot and go, oh, this is meant to be with that, and this is meant to be with that. You know, but Aphelios wasn't, because he just came out on his own. So Aphelios perhaps doesn't quite have the synergy with the champions and regions that, you know, some others do. And so what I think I'd actually do is, in the next releases, I would, you know, when they start printing like a couple cards for each region, I'd start giving Aphelios, you know, other things that maybe can create moon weapons, or very clearly synergize with Aphelios within Targon, to just help him feel like he has a more fleshed out, you know, archetype around him, rather than it just being like, you know, Gifts from Beyond and Aphelios and maybe the Veiled Temple as like the 3 cards that are meant for Aphelios. You know, I try and flesh it out a bit, give him a bit more, you know, room, maybe give him some obvious synergies within some other region as well. I think that that's what I'd be looking to do to try and help Aphelios. As I say, I would increase the health, but I really wouldn't buff these back to 2 mana. As I said, you could like slightly buff the weapons. You know, if this said 2/2, I think that that would be fine, right? Or if the Overwhelm one said 2/2 as well. You know, those kind of small changes would be absolutely fine, and I think most people could accept that. But you know, I don't want Aphelios to be the best champion of the game. I'll be honest. I don't want Aphelios to be the best champion of the game, probably ever again, if I'm being honest, because he just is too much value and too slow, and it just creates a horrible game to play. So I want Aphelios to be good, just not really good, if you get what I mean. So that's what I'd be looking to do. Slight buffs on Aphelios that maybe make people think, oh yeah, Aphelios, he's not that bad. Like, you know, you can play Aphelios, because I feel like now the perception of Aphelios is probably worse than Aphelios really truly is. I don't actually think he's that bad. You know, I played him in that Sump Worker deck where, you know, you use Crescendum to summon the Sump Workers, which I think was a really cool deck. But Aphelios wasn't that bad in that deck. He was actually pretty good. And so I think the perception is perhaps a bit behind on where Aphelios really is as a card. But, you know, a small buff like increasing his health might just make people think, oh yeah, Aphelios, yeah, he's not that bad anymore. You know, you can play Aphelios. Let's try it out. And so that's what I do for Aphelios. And that is our 3 champions for today. So stay tuned for 3 more champions again tomorrow. Again, don't at me for the champions that have been selected, because I didn't pick them. Riot told us what the champions that kind of need some help are. I'm sure that they look at that data as well and kind of go, okay, what champions need help? I'm sure that if any champion has like a 50+% win rate deck, they go, those don't buff those champions. You know, those champions are fine. And then they look at all the other ones. I'm sure that they do that. So essentially, I'm just going through Riot's process for you right now and talking about the different things that you could change for these champions. So with that in mind, thank you so much for watching, and have a really nice day. I'll see you tomorrow with 3 more champions with very low win rates as we continue down the list of champions without even a 49% win rate deck. And yes, Lucian was an absolute shock to me as well. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another Legend of Runeterra